Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Hazen. I am the Senior Digital Associate on the Communications and Strategy team and also one of the co-chairs at the Black at Brennan Employee Resource Group. And I am so excited to welcome you to our first event in person in nearly 3 years. So welcome. Tonight, we'll be in conversation with Mark Whitaker about his new book, exploring Black Power and the Civil Rights Movement. And for those of you joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute that works to repair, revitalize, and defend our systems of democracy and justice. You can stay up to date with key issues pertaining to democracy with weekly analysis and updates from Brennan Center experts by signing up for the briefing newsletter, and that's at brennancenter.org/briefing. And we are just thrilled to be hosting this important conversation in partnership with the NYU Law Black Allied Law Students Association. And with that, I want to introduce Jordan Ashley from BALSA.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Ashley Barnes, and I am one of the current co-chairs of the Black Allied Law Students Association here at NYU Law. And NYU Law is home to the founding chapter of the National Black Law Students Association, which was established with the goal of advancing the goals of Black law students. BALSA hosts a variety of social action events aimed at addressing social justice initiatives. Now, it is my honor with introducing our moderator for tonight's event, Eugene Robinson, columnist and associate editor at The Washington Post, and author Mark Whitaker, who will be diving into his newest book tonight, which is titled Saying It Loud, 1966, the year Black Power challenged the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and hello, everybody. It's great to be here. It's great to be here. I guess it's the first live event. It's great to be anywhere with people. With interesting people, and with my friend Mark Whitaker, who's written an incredible book, Saying It Loud. First of all, Mark, I don't do this a lot. I don't do a lot of these book events at all. I'm so happy to be doing it for Saying It Loud because it's a really, really good book. It's about some history. I was going to say recent history. That dates me because it was in my lifetime and I remember a good deal of it. For a lot of people, it's ancient history, but it's important history. It's the history of our country. And in Saying It Loud, you identified 1966 as a pivotal year, as the year when Black Power became a thing, as a year of real transformation in the civil rights movement in a lot of ways. And so how did you get to 1966? When you think of the civil rights movement, we all think of 1963, we think of the March on Washington, we think of 1965, some to Montgomery marches, we think of 1968, of course, the assassination of Dr. King. But you tell us why 1966 was such an important year. How'd you settle on that?
Well, the honest answer is I started out, I knew I wanted to write a book about Black Power. And I knew that the term Black Power was really popularized by Stokely Carmichael, the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in the summer of 1966. But I sort of had this idea that I was going to do this sweeping narrative history of the entire Black Power movement, going up at least until 1972 and the Angela Davis trial. So I started doing my research and my reporting, And after a year, I was still in 1966. Because so much had happened. And I hadn't put it together, and honestly, nobody really had in book form. It was the year when Stokely Carmichael became the chairman of SNCC and took it in a much more militant direction, deposing John Lewis, who had been the previous chairman. Then in the middle of the Meredith March, we can talk about how that happened, but it was sort of a sequel to the Selma March in 1966 through Mississippi. Stokely Carmichael, in the middle of a rally late at night, starts chanting Black Power. This gets picked up by the press, and there are stories around the country, and all of a sudden, everybody's talking about Black Power. It was the year when, in the fall of 1966, the Black Panther Party in Oakland was formed, borrowing a symbol that had been created for an all-black party that Stokely had helped create in Alabama, on the other side of the country. It was the year when Dr. King tried to take the civil rights movement to Chicago. It was the year when Julian Bond was denied his seat in the state legislature in Georgia. And on the cultural front, it was the year when, in significant numbers, young blacks said, we don't want to be called Negroes anymore. We want to be called blacks. People started growing afros. They started wearing dashikis. Kwanzaa was first celebrated in December 1966. So anyway, I thought that, and again, nobody had really, because, book writers, what you do is and I was a magazine editor for a long time, so I have lots of ideas, and then you say, oh, that would make a great book, and then you Google it, and of course it's been written.
But this had not been written.
But in this case, it had not miraculously been written, so I decided to write this book.
Well, that's great. Let's talk for a minute about just about that phrase, Black Power. I grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I will concretely date myself. I was born in 1954, so I would have been 12 years old. You were politically conscious if you grew up in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and you were an African American in those days. And so we were very aware of the civil rights movement in Orangeburg. There were two historically black colleges in Orangeburg. Our church, the minister was involved in the SCLC. But it's hard for people to understand how controversial, how shocking the phrase Black Power was, and even just the word black. We were Negroes. We were not black. And then in the blink of an eye, I guess I was the first in the house, really, because I was 12, and I was I was talking about black people, and my parents were looking at me like, where did we go wrong? What happened to Gene? And so it was shocking. And then the words Black Power were, just not to put too fine a point on it, but white people all over the country had their hair on fire hearing the word Black Power. So talk about the cultural.
Yeah, so the slogan, actually, Stokely Carmichael gets the credit for it, but actually it was another SNCC organizer named Willie Ricks, who was the first person to go around using that phrase. And so until 1966, the great sort of slogan of the civil rights movement was freedom now. Right? And so, you have a civil rights rally and whoever was speaking, often it would end with this call and response of what do we want? Freedom now, freedom now. Anyway, so Willie Ricks, again during the Meredith March, which began with James Meredith, who had become famous for integrating the University of Mississippi a few years earlier. He was actually in graduate school here in New York. He decides to go on his own to stage a rally or a march in support of voting rights, to march across the state of Mississippi by himself. On the second day of the march, a white supremacist jumps out from behind a bush on a highway and shoots him full of bird pellets. And he's hospitalized, badly wounded, can't carry on the march. And all of these other civil rights leaders converge on the state to carry on the march, to go from Memphis all the way to Jackson. And during the march, it was first Willie Ricks who was going into these small churches and small gatherings and getting people to chant Black Power. And he saw that it had like this electric effect on crowds. There was something about those words that if you just started chanting Black Power, all of a sudden everybody got very energized, they got very excited. And so it was Willie Ricks who kept telling Stokely, you got to do this, you got to drop this phrase yourself. And so finally they get to Greenwood, Mississippi, and it's at the end of a long day. They had arrived. Stokely had organized in Greenwood previously, so he knew the local people in the community. He reaches out to the local segregated black school to get permission to erect tents for the marchers to stay overnight. Despite the fact that he had permission, the cops show up and they arrest him and throw him in jail for the rest of the day. And he finally gets out in the early evening, and he arrives at they're having a nighttime rally in a sandlot field in the middle of Greenwood. About 500 people, some of the marchers and local black folks are all assembled in this field. He gets up on the back of a truck, and as he's getting onto the truck, Willie Ricks whispers in his ear, "Drop it now, they're ready, drop it now." And so he starts in the middle of the speech. He talks about, I've been to prison 27 times. I've had it. He said, we're tired about talking about freedom and freedom now. What we want is Black Power. And the crowd shouts back, Black Power. He says, we want Black Power, Black Power. This goes on and on and on for several minutes. There was a AP wire story, short AP wire story, reported that night, that was picked up the next day by over 200 newspapers around the country. How do I know this? Well, there's an online archive now called newspapers.com, where you can actually trace the number of newspapers that picked up that one wire service story. All of a sudden, everybody was talking about Black Power. There's a major story in Newsweek magazine and Time magazine. Face the Nation reaches out and books Stokely Carmichael to go on TV that Sunday. They fly him to Washington. So this phrase just took off like wildfire. And it meant, so it shows you the power of a phrase.
It does.
Today we think about Black Lives Matter, which, a whole movement sort of created around a phrase. But so that was, the power of it. The problem was that people read such different things into it.
They sure did.
So white folks saw it as, oh, you're talking about violence, you're talking about all black, they sort of assumed the worst from the very beginning. For black folks, it meant a number of things. For Stokely, it meant political organizing that went beyond just registering blacks to vote, but actually getting them to form their own political party so they could have their own candidates, right? So there was a political element to it. It also, we could talk about this later, there was an analysis of where the country was going in terms of integration.
Yes.
That was part of it, which was a big, but then there was also this cultural part, which I think black people sensed immediately. Just those words, like it meant pride. It meant being freer to express your black identity in a different way than had been done before. But white folks didn't see that.
Well, I'll tell you, it was electric in Orangeburg, South Carolina. I mean, we were out there almost immediately because there was something positive and forward-looking and powerful about the
I spoke, and I actually I turn over several pages at the end of the the book to an interview I did with my former Newsweek colleague, Vern Smith, who had grown up in Natchez, Mississippi, like in the deep, deep Klan-infested South, and had gone to college at San Francisco State University, where in 1966 they started advocating for Black Studies. That was actually where the first Black Studies program was eventually created as a result of a strike a couple of years later. And Vern was describing what happened to him and his friends at San Francisco, his Black friends at San Francisco State, and also back at Natchez when he went home for the summer. And he said it was like a born-again experience. That literally they felt like different people. And he said we were no longer Negroes, as you said. And which is a powerful thing when you think about it. It was like you're just thinking about yourself, your own identity, and your identity as a community in a completely different way.
Yeah, it was completely different. And one of the things that you do, one of the many things you do in this book, is you introduce us to a lot of people who were important to the civil rights movement, who might not be all that widely known. But you give us sort of mini profiles of a lot of people and who were there at pivotal moments, and a couple of them, a couple of people I know, and we'll get to at least one of those in a minute. But I want to start at the beginning of the book, because you open the book with a really gripping narrative. It's a story of a murder. Murder of a young man named Sammy Young. And I'm going to just talk about that for a second.
So Sammy Young grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama, which was known for the Tuskegee Institute, which had been started by Booker T. Washington, and had always been sort of a town that kind of bought into the Booker T. Washington idea of we should not be confrontational, we should be going to Black schools, we should be starting Black businesses, sort of be a self-sustaining Black community, not trying to make trouble. And he had fought with W.E.B. Du Bois and so forth over this. Anybody who's studied Black history knows that story. Anyway, and there was a very long-standing, prosperous, middle-class Black community in Tuskegee. And he was part of that. His father worked at the Veterans Hospital. He had actually gone away to prep school, to a white prep school in the North in his youth. He was not a particularly political kid. He went into the Army after, he was actually a little bit of a ne'er-do-well, a party boy. He went into the
pretty boy too.
Yeah, pretty boy too. Pretty boy too.
Good.
Very popular. And anyway, so he had gone into the military, and then he had health problems. He returns. He enrolls at Tuskegee, and really becomes interested and active in activism for the first time after the Selma March. Anyway, so he gets involved with activism. He meets Stokely Carmichael, gets a little bit involved with SNCC protests, then gives it up for a while, then gets back into it. Anyway, on the third day of the month, and one of the things I do throughout the book is I sort of take you from place to place and date to date and all these sort of dramatic things that happened over the year. On the third day of January, he had spent the day registering Blacks in the Tuskegee area to vote. And he goes to a party on campus, just an ordinary, and there's dancing and there's drinking. And then around midnight, people get hungry and they find some tuna fish, but they don't have mayonnaise to make sandwiches. And Sammy, because he's middle class and so forth, he actually has a car. So he volunteers to drive into town to get some mayonnaise and to get some cigarettes for somebody had run out. He goes to the gas station in town, which has a little shop next to it. He goes in, and there's an elderly white clerk behind the counter. He asks to use the restroom inside the convenience store, and this guy says, no, you have to use the one out back. So they get into an argument about this. The clerk pulls a gun out from behind the counter. Sammy leaves, going to get in his car. The clerk follows him out of the store and shoots him dead. Now, this, interestingly, so we all know about, the young people who were involved in that era in the lunch counter sit-ins and the freedom rides, and there were a lot of students who were really on the front lines of protest, but there were also a lot of students, black students, like Sammy Young, in HBCUs and across the South who were not particularly political. So the news that this guy who had been killed not at a protest, but just for trying to use a restroom at a gas station in Tuskegee, which was not a particularly violent place, it actually sent shockwaves through the student population, the black student population in the South and elsewhere too. And it was one of these things very on in the year that kind of was a sign that this was going to be a different kind of year. More people were going to get going to get sort of involved in activism. The whole tone of the debate, particularly among young blacks, was going to become more militant, more impatient, and and like I say, it was one of these things that had a huge impact in Black America at the time that white America just was barely conscious of.
Yeah, and tell what happened to the man who shot.
Well, of course, he went on trial and was acquitted by an all-white jury in about an hour. But that was par for the course.
Shot an unarmed man in cold blood, and he was tried and he was acquitted.
Right. In no time.
And that's what happened. And that thing about the restroom in the back, that was a thing. That was a real thing. I remember around this time, my dad taking us all out for a family drive on a Sunday, and you were very, in South Carolina, you were very careful what service station you stopped at, right? Because you didn't know what it was like. But my grandmother had to use the restroom, and so he pulls into this I think it was an Esso station, and the clerk says she has to use the restroom in the back. And I thought my father was going to explode at that time. And he had his family with him, nothing, what could he do? My father had grown up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and moved south to marry my mother. And so he'd been in the South for a while, he knew what was what, but, and I just remember his anger, when we got home. I think he wrote like letters to every, the CEO of Esso and to everybody, just sort of reporting that this had happened. But it was, that was the South in that time. That was what it was like. You introduce us to a lot of people. One of the people you mentioned is a man named Cleve Sellers. Right, from South Carolina. Talk about him a little bit. He was an important person. And
he was. So he was. So there was this whole new leadership that took over SNCC.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Coordinating Committee, which was, had come out of the student lunch counter sit-in movement, had been devoted until 1966, mostly in a very kind of low-key way, going into these very dangerous parts of the South to register black folks to vote. John Lewis was the chairman. They had there's a whole chapter devoted to a retreat that they have in the spring where they were supposed to elect officers for the new year. John Lewis, who had become famous, for, sort of being beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the Selma March, and had been going around the country giving speeches and raising money. He arrives at this retreat expecting to be reelected easily, and actually does win a first ballot, but then a lot of people abstain because he had become controversial within SNCC because there were a lot of SNCC members, the sort of more militant faction, that thought he was too close to Dr. King. that he spent too much time cozying up to President Johnson. Anyway, so someone demands a second vote, and all hell breaks loose, and there's this huge fighting and debate that goes on all night long. And at the crack of dawn, they stage another vote, and Stokely wins the vote. And so John Lewis was removed as chairman. It crushed him. I mean, we now remember him as this sainted, congressman for decades. But this was his whole identity. He grew up as a poor sharecropper in Alabama, and it really, he left SNCC several months later, and it really took him over a decade to recover from that. Anyway, so the leadership that took over, Stokely was the one who got all the press and who liked the press. His nickname within SNCC was Stokely Starmichael because he liked publicity so much, and that became part of the story as the year went on as well. But the other two major officers, one was this fascinating woman, Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, who became the executive secretary and really was in charge of running SNCC out of the Atlanta headquarters. And Cleve Sellers was the program director. And Cleve had come up with Stokely, he was kind of, this more sort of militant, he was the one who got SNCC, or one of the major forces in getting SNCC to come out against the war in Vietnam a year before Dr. King did. Who also was sort of, really, again, he wrote, it's a short but a interesting, good memoir himself, and he's the one who really, he didn't coin it, but he really talks about this black consciousness, which sort of became, a thing. But Stokely was an incredibly handsome, charismatic, funny guy, but once he got into the limelight, it really sort of went to his head. Yeah. And so a lot of the story on the SNCC side, and there's several other strains of the story that have to do with the Panthers on the West Coast and Chicago, but there's increasing tension even among this new generation because of Stokely.
Starmichael,
right. Stokely being Stokely.
So very quickly, my Cleve Sellers story is a couple of years later, 1968, Orangeburg, South Carolina, my hometown. Two historically black colleges there, Claflin University, South Carolina State. Cleve Sellers was the organizer of a protest in February 1968. Started at a segregated bowling alley. There was one bowling alley in town, and a whole bunch of college students in one bowling alley, and it was whites only, organized as a club. So if you were white, you were in the club, and if you were black, you couldn't join the club, and so you were. So that's where it started, and then it became a larger, it became a Black Power demonstration, really.
Yeah, it's famous. Yeah.
And it so it went on all day, and all night, and then into a second day, and Cleve was the organizer. So the second day of the protest, this was all very near my house, and I got up to, they had closed the schools and everything, so I got up to, I was in high school, look out the window to see what was going on down at where the protest was. My father yelled at me to get down out of the window right now, and he had brought out from under the bed the shotgun that he had, which he never brought. I mean, he didn't hunt or anything like that, but that was for protection. And so I was like, okay, this is not cool. He let me peek over the windowsill, and there was a line of a dozen highway patrol cars. The state troopers were out of their cars, and the doors were open. They were crouched down, and they had their rifles trained at a house 2 doors down from ours. That's where they thought Cleve was staying, and they had come to arrest him. And he had better intelligence and more intelligence than they had, and so he was gone. So they couldn't arrest him. And then that night, the state troopers claimed to have been fired on from the South Carolina State campus. There was never any evidence of any gunfire, none. But they fired into the crowd and injured, I think, 27 people and killed 3 young black men in what came to be known as the Orangeburg Massacre. Yeah. And I was giving a speech a few years ago, and I told that story that I just told. And over there in the audience, some people are pointing at somebody like this. They're going like this. And I look out, and sitting out there is Cleveland Sellers. He was the only person to serve any jail time because of the Orangeburg Massacre. State troopers were all acquitted, they were not charged, but he, for some reason they put him in, anyhow, they convicted him of something for a little while. He got out, he eventually became president of Voorhees College, a historically black college down the road in Denmark, South Carolina. And he happened to be there in the audience when I told the story, and so I got to see him. So, what can we sort of fast forward a bit? I mean, what does what you found out about 1966, what if anything, does it tell you about today?
Well, there are so many. Well, first of all, there is 2 things that are very much in the headlines today. One is police violence. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of these incidents that are sort of turning points in my book, they all begin with, these run-ins with the police. There's one in Atlanta, there's, in Chicago. And the Black Panther Party, which was formed in the fall by Huey Newton, Bobby Seale in Oakland, California. They wrote this 10-point program, which is sort of now famous, and a lot of it was kind of unrealistic and and so forth. But the major thing that they were focused on, and they started doing immediately, was to form civilian patrols to go around Oakland just to keep an eye on the police to make sure that they didn't abuse their power in dealing with black folks, right? And of course they were, what made them particularly controversial was that, and there were civilian patrols. It wasn't a new idea. They had this in Watts and in other places before that. But Huey Newton figured out that in California at the time they had open carry gun laws. Where it was legal, you could carry firearms as long as they were visible. And he said, well, we have a right to do this. So his twist on it was they were going to be armed. Plus they had these cool uniforms, the berets and the leather jackets, which actually they borrowed from somebody else who I write about, who hasn't been written up enough about in Oakland. When you think about it, and of course, because it was young black guys, in leather jackets carrying guns, they got all of this attention. But when you think about that idea, why do we know about all of these horrific incidents today? It's because of cell phones. It's because of police body cam. Well, essentially, their idea is like we're going to be human witnesses, right? It's not in today's context. You think about it, it wasn't a crazy idea. Black studies, obviously, is very much in the news right now, and I think misunderstood because if you know the history of black studies, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who's going after, black studies, basically, if you listen to Ron DeSantis, you would think that the whole purpose of black studies was to teach white kids about white supremacy. Right, and to make them feel bad about their privilege. Right. In fact, black studies began with black students on campuses arguing for it for themselves. Exactly. They thought they didn't know enough about their own history. And by the way, what was the alternative? This was a time when, by the late 60s, you had the Panthers and other, on college campuses trying to get these college kids to pick up guns,
Yeah.
to become part of the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
In previous eras, we would have had Marcus Garvey and black nationalists telling them to get on a boat and leave the country and go someplace else. All they were asking, their way of sort of manifesting this new spirit of black power, was to have black studies. So obviously that's still very relevant.
Current.
And then the other thing I just want to say is about this whole issue of integration, because like what was different, and all this attention got paid in this shift in 1966 to the different conversation about nonviolence, and the fact that the Black Power generation was saying, having worked in the Deep South, having, been grown up in places like Oakland, facing the kind of gun violence that they did, that we can't just unilaterally disarm in these places, right? Mm-hmm. And that was part of their message, but that got, sort of all the press, attention in the white press. But the other thing that they were saying, which was profound, was that what King had been advocating, was sort of the pursuit of this goal of integration.
Right.
Right. So famously in the March on Washington, I have a dream. What is the dream? The dream is of this peaceful, integrated. Mm-hmm. This young black generation, some of whom were products of the Great Migration, had gone north, hoping that they would, move to places where they could integrate, and had discovered that they ended up in ghettos and so forth, in Oakland and so forth and so on. And essentially what they were saying was, this whole integration project, it's really being, it's being pushed by middle-class blacks who, if they're lucky, will find enlightened middle-class whites who might be willing to integrate with people like them. Uh-huh. But white folks don't have any interest in integrating with poor blacks in the South, with sharecroppers. They don't have any interest in integrating with black folks in the inner city. And you know what? That's still true. It is still true in America today. Yeah. So one of the things that Black Power stood for is, how do we sort of develop a culture and a way of thinking about ourselves that allows us to continue to stay here, to be Americans, right, but side by side with white people in a society where white people really don't want
us. And the answer is black political and economic power, basically.
Yes, yes, and cultural, and it's also culture. Yeah. And honestly, that's still very much with us today.
Yeah, I've got to like the one big reveal in the book to me was about the Black Panthers, because I like the name and the whole Panther thing and everything. I knew that was Oakland. That was Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, and that was Oakland, but it wasn't.
Well, no, it started, as I said, Stokely Carmichael, before he became Star Michael, he had been the field organizer in a impoverished, backwater in Alabama called Lowndes County. This is a place where blacks had overwhelming majority of the population, 80+%. Not a single black person had been allowed to vote in over 60 years. Mm-hmm. And so, and basically Stokely, SNCC had been through this very disheartening experience in Mississippi in 1964. Probably a lot of you know about this. It was called Freedom Summer. They recruited all of these black folks and white students to go down, spend the summer of 1964 in Mississippi, organizing folks to vote. And by the end of the summer, they there was a faction of the Democratic Party in Mississippi that had been created. The leader was Fannie Lou Hamer, who many of you probably heard of. And they go to the Democratic Convention in 1964 in Atlantic City, trying to get the convention to seat the Mississippi Freedom Democrats, the black faction, in place of the white delegation from Mississippi, which were like openly white supremacist. And they think they have a deal to do this, and with the support of Lyndon Johnson or people around him, who was the presumptive nominee, and Dr. King and so forth. And at the convention, Fannie Lou Hamer gives this great speech, and it looks like it's going to happen, and then it all falls apart. And that basically LBJ demanded that Hubert Humphrey basically do this deal to just, in the end they get offered 2 token seats on the floor. Fannie Lou Hamer says, I didn't come all the way here for no 2 seats. She refuses to go along with this deal. Anyway, the lesson for Stokely Carmichael was, what are we doing organizing all of these black folks, in places like Mississippi and Alabama, when all they have to vote for are, these white supremacists, the
right.
George Wallace.
George Wallace was a Democrat.
Yeah, and so he spends the year before 1966, leading into 1966, not only organizing all these black voters in Lowndes County, but getting them to form their own new, from scratch, political party with a nominating convention, nominate candidates. It was kind of a miracle that this happened. And under Alabama law, one of the provisions, if you wanted to start a new party, is that you had to choose a symbol, and it was historically an animal, that could be identified by voters who were illiterate, who couldn't read. And we think about the donkey and the elephant and so forth in Mississippi, in Alabama at the time. The donkey wasn't good enough for the Alabama the Wallace Party. Their emblem was a rooster, and their slogan was "White supremacy for the right." It was like right there under the rooster. So they weren't hiding it at all. Anyway, so they form this new party, and the symbol they choose is the Black Panther. So that, not only the name, the symbol, but the drawing of the Black Panther that was created in Lowndes County, Alabama, in early 1966, is the very same one that was adopted by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale when they created the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland in the fall of 1966. On the entire, like a world away, literally the other end of the country, completely different circumstances, and the Panther slithers all the way from one side of America to the other.
Slinks, I think.
Slinks is
He prowls.
Prowls, yes.
Panthers prowl. There you go. Thank you for indulging me. And now we have some questions from the audience, so I'm going to dive in. One is, how have other movements for liberation absorbed or adapted the philosophy and tactics of Black Power?
Well, I think this whole idea of sort of, now it's, identity politics has sort of become, for some people, sort of a dirty word. But I think clearly this idea that there was, a politics that wasn't just about sort of, passing legislation. It wasn't, but was also about, sort of the right to sort of express your identity culturally and politically and so forth. You see that in short order with the women's movement and, with the LGBTQ movement. And other movements. You could argue, honestly, and I say this in the book, that there are echoes even in the sort of white, nationalist kind of movement that you see now, around Trump. Actually, there are a couple of scenes that Ruby Doris Robinson, who I talked about, she was fascinating, not only because she was such an interesting person in her own right, and she was 25 years old, she had grown up in Atlanta, she had gone to Spelman College. Everybody was scared of her. She was really, incredibly efficient and tough. She ended up clashing with Stokely because she thought that, a lot of his grandstanding really wasn't doing the organization much good. But she was also someone who, along with some white volunteers in Atlanta before, and this is another thing that happened in 1966, by the end of the year, the SNCC kicks all the remaining white people out of the organization. But previous to that, there had been white volunteers, in the field, but most of them in the Atlanta office, including women. One of them was at the time was married to Tom Hayden, Casey Hayden, who just passed away. And they staged a little sit-in strike because they felt like they were just being given secretarial duties and weren't being taken seriously enough and so forth. They had kind of like a sit-in in the Atlanta office, and at another one of these yearly SNCC retreats, Casey Hayden and Mary King, two of these white volunteers, circulated a paper where they talked about the sexism within SNCC.
Well, let's talk about sexism for a while.
A lot of the early pioneers of the women's movement, which really sort of starts to sort of come into being just a few years later, were responding to the experiences they had had within the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement.
Interesting. Well, that's a perfect segue into one of the questions, which is how were women treated in the Black Power movement in 1966? I mean, you mentioned Ruby Robinson, you mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer, but in the book, you mentioned a number of women who basically made these various organizations a function.
Oh, absolutely.
For a long time, and who are not well known, certainly not like Stokely Carmichael.
Well, one of the reasons they're not well known is that even at the time they were not being written about. Right? So there was a lot of press coverage when Stokely, at this retreat in Kingston Springs, Tennessee, when Stokely took over from John Lewis, that made there were a lot of stories about that, but very little mention of the fact that Ruby Doris Robinson had been elected to the number 2 position, making her the most powerful woman in the civil rights movement at that time. She was 25 years old. She absolutely ran the organization. I mean, she made up the budgets, she handled the fundraising, she did the hiring. And then later, sadly, she passed away of cancer the next year, and it's a very sad story. And she's really one of these characters that once you get to know her, you think like, if she had lived, perhaps things would have ended up differently at SNCC, and certainly she might have gone on to really be a leader in the larger movement. But then the Panthers. The Panthers were just getting started in 1966. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, they create the Panthers, they name them, and then just at the very end, Eldridge Cleaver, who had been in jail, gets released. And it wasn't until early 1967 that they teamed up, but you can kind of sort of see the kind of what happened with the Panthers eventually happens, the personality clashes, and so forth and so on. And I write at the end of the book in the epilogue about kind of how that all played out. But once things like totally, got crazy with the Panthers, and Huey Newton was in jail, and Eldridge Cleaver had to flee the country, and the FBI, started this war of persecution against them. Who picked up the pieces? Who was running the Panthers? It was women. It was Elaine Brown. It was Erica Hutchins. It was like they took over to the degree that the Panthers even survived into the 70s. It was thanks to women.
It was the women.
Right.
Okay, here's another question. Was there any relationship between Muhammad Ali and SNCC? Did they have a relationship in 1960?
No, not really. Obviously, Ali had become involved with the Nation of Islam and had become friendly with Malcolm X.
There is a meeting with Malcolm X.
And he meets with Malcolm X. Stokely did, after he took over at SNCC, he got, actually, I learned about this from Cleve Sellers. It's a very funny account of this, because Cleve Sellers was there. So all of a sudden, he gets word that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was the head of the Nation of Islam, wants to meet with him. Right, and so they go to Chicago, where the Nation of Islam was headquartered, and they go to meet with Elijah Muhammad, and Cleve Sellers says, here's this man and he's in this big mansion and he's talking about like white devils and something about a spaceship and they sort of figured out that this is not someone they necessarily wanted to be involved with. But then Elijah Muhammad invites Stokely and Cleve to dinner at his home in Chicago, and there's Ali. And this was before Ali really sort of came out publicly. But just while we're on the subject of Malcolm, once I decided I wanted to write about 66, and people would say, I'd say, well, I'm writing about the birth of Black Power in 1966, and a lot of people who didn't necessarily, remember all the dates would say, Malcolm X, right? And I would say, no, actually, he was assassinated in early 1965, so he's not really around. Turns out he is a huge figure in this book, in death, because all of these, Stokely, the Panthers, all of these figures, they looked up to him. They thought that they were doing what he would have wanted them to do. His biography, the famous autobiography of Malcolm X only came out after his assassination. It came out in hardcover at the end of 1965. It wasn't a huge printing, but it got a lot of attention. So when the paperback came out a year later in 1966, Grove Press, which had picked it up when the original publisher got too frightened to publish it, went to town, had this huge printing, did all this marketing for the book, and it was when the paperback came out in 1966 that everybody read that book, and Malcolm X became, a far more famous figure in death than he ever had been in life.
Yeah, perfect. So here's another question. Are there lessons for confronting the anti-CRT wave of legislation?
Well, there are a couple of lessons. My basic, if I was trapped in an elevator, and had to sort of say what my conclusions, were before, the elevator door opened, I would say, and it sort of surprised me. I didn't necessarily know I would come out this way, but I thought that going into it, I sort of thought, well, the Black Power, they were really cool, and charismatic, but their program was kind of crazy, right? And actually, what I came away thinking was actually their program at the beginning was not crazy.
It was not crazy.
That their analysis of what was wrong with the previous generation, previous kind of civil rights message, they weren't wrong about that. A lot of their analysis was correct. A lot of the things they started to do kind of, made some sense, but it really got out of hand, and that they partly, look, they were up against the FBI, they were up against, really distorted media coverage, but, they also, in some cases it went to their heads, there was infighting, there were all these kind of, personal factors. So I would say that lessons today, one is about messaging, right? So you really have to be clear, when you unleash these slogans, whether, and critical race theory was not something that was necessarily unleashed by activists, but when you're dealing in the world of slogans, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, critical race theory, in those days it was Black Power, you have to be ready to really define what it is you're talking about, because the people you're up against, whether it's the press or your opponents, political, they're going to define it for you.
Yeah.
Right. And Stokely, I have all of these scenes. He appears. So once he becomes famous, all of a sudden he's on Face the Nation, Meet the Press. He's interviewed on a primetime special by Mike Wallace on CBS, and they keep giving him this opportunity. Mr. Carmichael, this is your opportunity. Tell white America what you mean by Black Power. And he would say something really outrageous, and provocative, maybe something that his followers, people, would have applauded, but was not really doing, the work of educating white folks. So I think messaging is important, and then leadership too. I think one of the things that that compared with the civil rights movement, where at least or the previous era, where once Dr. King and a few others, but particularly Dr. King, became identified as the leader. Mm-hmm. When the press, or politics wanted to know, like, what does Black America want? What is it talking about? They could go to Dr. King, right? Mm-hmm. And then in the Black Lives Matter, if Malcolm X had lived, perhaps he would have been that figure. Mm-hmm. But absent that, there was no person they could go to, who had that kind of level of respect. Mm-hmm. So now, on an issue like critical race theory, when people go around saying, "Oh, it's being indoctrinated in schools and stuff," which is crazy. I mean, it was created, as you all know here. It was created in law schools.
In law schools. It was very esoteric.
Exactly. And so it's become this kind of shorthand. But there, there are a lot of people out there who are making that point, but there's no one who has that kind of stature. Mm-hmm. People who can kind of push back on this, and everybody will listen in the way that you wish they would.
That's right. Especially when it's when people with giant megaphones are just very deliberately and effectively lying about it.
Yes.
In a way that's difficult to counteract. It's says the columnist who writes about this sometimes, and wants to weep at this stuff. One of the things that struck me about the book, though, was that when you looked at the initial sort of analysis of Stokely and the others who sort of were coming to this concept of Black power and Black consciousness, it's striking how just sort of tame it seems in a lot of ways. I mean, Black political and economic power, and as an end,
and by the way, so the idea of Stokely also sort of got out ahead of himself, because having had the success in forming the party and having a nominating convention, he was suggesting that this could be a model for Black political organizing around the country, and there hadn't even been a general election yet.
Yeah, right.
And in the fall of 1966, all of the candidates from the original Black Panther Party, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, lose. Eventually, the founder of the party, who didn't run in 1966 but ran for sheriff a couple of years later, was elected sheriff, but that was after there had been a faction of the white Alabama Democratic Party which had split from Wallace and allied itself. Yeah. So it's interesting because I write about this at the end of the book, and I know there are some real experts in this area of politics out there in the audience, but so the idea of Black folks using their political power in places where they had a kind of critical voting mass, of course, becomes transformational in American politics. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so soon you start having Black mayors, and you have Black congressmen, and so forth and so on. So that.
Right, and you have the South Carolina primary in 2020, and Joe Biden gets elected.
But to the degree that you have, on the one hand, so that is part of Black power in 1966. But another part, in my mind, a more unfortunate part, by the end of the year, is this whole idea that it has to be all Black.
Yeah.
Right? And so the white members, the remaining white members, are kicked out of SNCC. There are all of these, going forward in SNCC, and actually the Panthers were more open to white alliances, as long as they were, white radicals who kind of shared their political agenda. But despite the fact that Black political organizing, for Black candidates, becomes something that, becomes, a very important part of our politics from then on, it only works with white alliances, right? So you still need, in all of these cities and all of these congressional districts, when Barack Obama is elected president of the United States, I had forgotten that he lost the white vote by 12 points to John McCain.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, so you know, he needed this, you know, outpouring of black support. But he also needed to appeal to white folks.
To white voters,
you know? And so I think in politics, and I think it's also true in activism, another lesson, people say, well, what are the lessons today? Alliances, 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 alliances. You know, you can't really get anything done still, without alliances.
Politics has to be a process of addition, not subtraction. You have to add. You have to bring people in and on your side in order to get stuff done. So we're coming to the end of the evening, but I want to just say, what haven't I asked you? What do you want the good people here and me and everybody else to take away?
Well, I would say, it was interesting because this is. We live in an era, I think, where a lot of people want to kind of reduce history sort of to one thing, right? Yeah. And one of the, I guess it wasn't a concern, but I sort of, going into this, I thought, okay, well, like writing about all these figures, there are all these people, there are people today who probably, to the degree that they think about the Black Panther, the Black Power era and these characters, think they were just bad news, right? They took a noble movement, led by Dr. King, and they kind of screwed it all up. And they brought forth, and this is a big part of the story, is 1966 too, is the white backlash.
Yes.
Which really makes 1966 a turning point in American politics that I think has been underappreciated.
Absolutely.
Ronald Reagan was elected governor of California. Exactly. The Republican Party, which had been left for dead after the 64 and Goldwater.
It finds a new.
They pick up all these seats.
Richard Nixon starts his comeback.
They pick up all these seats in the House, state houses. Richard Nixon starts thinking about running for president. So the backlash. Is part of it too, but and then there are other people. So some people think bad news, some people think romanticized, and there's all of it in this, all of these people had really compelling qualities, but also deep flaws. There were these large historical forces that were at play, but there were also just kind of internal, politics and personality clashes and regional differences and religious differences, and I think that I think that's what history shows you. That's what history shows you, and that it's a story. It's a really rich story, and I think so much of it still resonates today. But I think we would also be well served in this incredibly polarized era where everything gets reduced to a tweet.
Exactly.
To recognize that things are complicated. Politics is complicated, activism is complicated, and I think to really accomplish anything, meaningful and lasting, you have to understand the full complexity. So I would hope that people reading the book would enjoy a really, really complicated, rich story, but then also bring with it a feeling like, oh wow, we have to kind of, maybe in the way we think about what's going on today, also appreciate what's going on in all of its complexity as well.
That is great. I mean, let me just end with a couple of observations. Number one, that's all true, but it's also a page turner. I mean, this is a this is a story that just that brings you along and makes you turn the page. And so read this book. This is a really, really good book. And the way to think about it, and now I'll get on my soapbox, is yes, this is African American history, but this is American history. This is the history of this country. Because the history of this country is not complete, anywhere near complete, without African American history, a lot of which has not been told. And Mark has just done a magnificent job of telling the story of Black Power, the story of 1966. And it's a piece of American history that everybody really should read. So I thank you for writing it. And I thank all of you. Thank all of you for coming. Thank you.